A storm was declared over Africa, not by the skies but by a voice on the telephone. In the stillness of Ouagadougou's presidential palace, a midnight ultimatum was delivered. 48 hours. That was the deadline imposed upon President Ibrahim Traoré by Benjamin Netanyahu. The demand was absolute: resign at once, restore suspended mining contracts worth billions, and reopen security cooperation. This was not diplomacy, it was coercion dressed in protocol. The weight of those words did not only fall upon one leader. They fell upon a continent still scarred by centuries of extraction and submission. Could a landlocked nation with a fragile economy resist a threat forged in boardrooms and war rooms far beyond its borders? Or was this yet another chapter where Africa's sovereignty was reduced to a line item in somebody else's ledger? But history, like soil, responds differently depending on the seed that is sown. In the silence that followed, a young leader prepared to answer, not with surrender, but with defiance. And the world began to watch the clock. Do not look away. What comes next may change the map of history. Subscribe and stay with us as we walk through these 48 hours of fire and defiance. It began with the ringing of a telephone, a sound so ordinary yet carrying the weight of empires. Inside the presidential palace of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré was confronted with a demand that would test not only his leadership, but the dignity of an entire continent. On the other end of the line, Benjamin Netanyahu was not extending the courtesy of dialogue. He was delivering an ultimatum: 48 hours to resign, to restore suspended mining deals worth billions of United States dollars, and to reopen security cooperation with Israel. The voice carried no room for negotiation, only command. For a nation whose gross domestic product barely reached $20 billion, the demand struck like thunder. The very resources buried beneath Burkina Faso's soil, its gold and its oil, were treated as entries on a balance sheet rather than lifelines for its people. The ultimatum reduced sovereignty to arithmetic. One man in a foreign capital was declaring how another nation must govern, as if independence itself were an illusion waiting to be revoked. Traoré's advisors saw the danger immediately. To comply was to surrender more than his presidency. It was to surrender the nation's dignity. Yet defiance promised consequences too great to measure. Would the banks collapse? Would the people be left in the dark? Would foreign powers tighten the noose until Burkina Faso choked on its own isolation? The room grew heavy with questions no one dared to answer. Beyond the palace walls, whispers spread quickly. News of the ultimatum filtered into the markets of Ouagadougou, where traders asked whether their goods would still find buyers tomorrow. Mothers feared for remittances that sustained their families. Students debated whether their future would be written in resignation or in resistance. The countdown had already begun, and every second seemed louder than the last. The demand from Tel Aviv was not merely political, it was a signal to the world. It was a reminder of how fragile independence could appear when weighed against the machinery of global finance and security. For decades, nations across the Sahel had been told that partnership meant obedience, and that contracts written in foreign languages carried more authority than the voices of their own citizens. To Netanyahu, the ultimatum was a transaction. To Traoré, it was a test of existence. As the hours ticked away, images of the ultimatum took on symbolic force. Commentators described it as a noose tightening around the neck of a small nation. Others called it a shadow over the Sahel. Yet among the people, another metaphor began to grow, that of a seed buried deep in scorched soil. If pressed hard enough, that seed might break open, not in submission but in growth. The ultimatum could either suffocate Burkina Faso or awaken it. Inside the palace, Traoré remained silent at first. Observers mistook this silence for hesitation. In truth, it was calculation. Without nuclear weapons, without the weight of a trillion-dollar economy, what weapon did Burkina Faso possess? Only one: the refusal to bow. But to refuse meant gambling with more than personal survival. It meant gambling with the hopes of millions. The foreign pressure was not only financial. Behind the ultimatum loomed the threat of destabilization. Traoré's intelligence chiefs warned that the ultimatum could be the opening shot in a broader campaign. Cyber strikes, disinformation, covert attempts to fracture the army. Every option carried risk. Compliance would preserve calm in the short term, but enshrine dependence for generations. Defiance could ignite solidarity or collapse. As midnight passed into morning, the palace still carried the weight of silence. Outside, the people of Ouagadougou woke to a day unlike any other. Sensing history had crept into their homes. The air was thick with both fear and possibility. Some prayed, others marched. All understood that what happened in those 48 hours would echo far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. For in this moment, Africa was watching. Mali, Niger, Chad, nations equally vulnerable to ultimatums cloaked as diplomacy, looked to see whether one small state could stand. The ultimatum was no longer about one man or one government. It had become a mirror in which the continent saw itself. And as the clock continued to tick, the world held its breath. Would Traoré yield to the dictates of foreign power? Or would he gamble everything on the fragile but unbreakable claim of sovereignty? The answer was coming, but not yet. The silence inside the palace was not surrender. It was the gathering of resolve before the storm. The question lingered like a drumbeat. When the ultimatum expired, would Traoré bow to the weight of foreign power, or would he speak with the fire of defiance? When the hour of choice arrived, Ibrahim Traoré did not reach for careful words. He chose one syllable, sharp as steel, never. That single word shattered the silence of the ultimatum. It was not a speech nor a negotiation. It was resistance distilled into sound, the refusal to trade dignity for survival. From that moment, the 48 hours became a theater of confrontation. Israel's threats shifted from paper to practice. The first blow came in the invisible domain, cyber war. Banking systems across Ouagadougou flickered and failed. Automated teller machines spat out error codes. Transactions froze. Within hours, panic spread as citizens realized millions of United States dollars in remittances and trade had evaporated into uncertainty. By dawn, estimates of the financial sabotage reached over $50 million, a staggering figure for a nation whose annual budget was already stretched to its limit. The attacks did not stop at money. Power grids trembled under sudden overloads. Neighborhoods descended into darkness. News broadcasts warped with strange interruptions. Static hissing, images dissolving into fragments. On social networks, a second wave struck. Fabricated reports claimed Traoré had already resigned. Slickly edited videos portrayed him as isolated, abandoned by allies, and on the brink of flight. Even analysts in Western capitals began to speculate whether Burkina Faso's currency reserves, scarcely $2 billion, were collapsing. It was psychological warfare, designed to make defiance appear foolish. Yet in the streets, the reaction was the opposite. Crowds gathered outside the palace chanting not with fear, but with conviction. We choose Traoré, not Tel Aviv. Mothers carried infants on their backs. Students painted banners. Elders invoked the memory of anti-colonial struggles. Their words echoed across the Sahel. Sovereignty was not for sale. But this resistance was fragile. Bread prices rose. Traders hesitated to accept digital payments. Families who relied on remittances from Europe and America found themselves suddenly cut off. The ultimatum was not abstract. It was lived in empty wallets and darkened homes. The question haunted the air. How long could a people endure before necessity forced submission? As the hours dragged, alliances began to stir. From Venezuela came a symbolic gesture, an offer of asylum for Traoré should the storm become unbearable. From Tehran, promises of cyber defense teams to help shield the fragile networks under attack. Moscow signaled readiness to dispatch advisors, while Beijing pledged soft loans and infrastructure projects worth hundreds of millions. Each gesture was both lifeline and chain, aid offered not without expectation. Yet to the people of Burkina Faso, these alliances whispered a crucial truth. They were not alone. In this crucible, the notion of sovereignty was tested. Could a small nation without nuclear warheads, without vast armies, transform the mere act of refusal into a weapon? Traoré's gamble was that dignity itself could be the strongest arsenal. For while money could vanish and systems could collapse, the will of a people could not be digitally erased. The foreign campaign, intended to isolate, instead ignited a movement. Across Africa, young activists, engineers, and students mobilized online. They dissected fake news, exposed manipulated videos, and flooded networks with counter-narratives. They called themselves the firewall of dignity. What was meant as disinformation became the spark for digital resistance. In Nairobi, Lagos, and Johannesburg, live streams taught lessons in cyber sovereignty. The countdown meant to terrify was transformed into a classroom of defiance. Still, the risks were undeniable. Each blackout, each banking outage was a reminder that sovereignty in the 21st century was vulnerable to keystrokes as much as to bullets. Each rumor of collapse made foreign investors recalculate. Markets fluttered, oil prices wavered, and whispers grew in European boardrooms. Was Burkina Faso investable? To answer that question, They looked not at the people, but at the ultimatum's clock. And yet, as the 40th hour passed, something remarkable was happening. The fear that had first gripped Ouagadougou was turning into pride. What had begun as whispers of collapse became chants of resistance. The ultimatum was no longer Netanyahu's weapon. It had become Traoré's test. And with each tick of the clock, the young leader's defiance grew louder, echoed by thousands of voices who refused to bow. But as the deadline drew near, the question sharpened. Was this defiance building the foundation of freedom, or was it only accelerating the fall into chaos? The storm did not end when Traoré spoke his single word of defiance. It merely shifted its battleground. In the days that followed, ordinary Burkinabe families bore the heaviest weight of the crisis. The banking outages meant that tens of thousands were cut off from remittances, a lifeline worth over $400 million annually. For a mother in Bobo Dioulasso, that meant her child's school fees vanished with a frozen transaction. For a farmer near Kaya, it meant the payment for his harvest sat locked inside a digital vault he could not reach. Shops reopened under candlelight, their shelves stocked but their tills silent. Students could no longer rely on online platforms for study. Hospitals reported delays in supplies as foreign partners hesitated to wire funds. Sovereignty, once an idea, became an everyday struggle measured in lost meals and unanswered calls. Yet amid the hardship, something unexpected grew. Young engineers, activists, and students formed digital brigades. They called themselves the Firewall of Dignity. These were not soldiers with rifles, but citizens armed with laptops and conviction. They hunted down fake news, traced the origins of manipulated videos, and published counter-narratives. In hours, hashtags in solidarity with Traoré trended not only across Africa but also worldwide. What was meant to be 48 hours of fear was recast as 48 hours of defiance. Still, the political atmosphere in Ouagadougou remained tense. Senior officers within the military debated quietly whether Traoré's gamble endangered national security. Opposition figures warned of economic collapse if confrontation continued. International mediators whispered of coups, the familiar specter that had haunted Burkina Faso for decades. Here the phrase Ibrahim Traoré coup began to circulate in diplomatic corridors, not as an action taken, but as a question hanging in the air. Would foreign pressure succeed where domestic dissent might waver? The paradox was clear. On one hand, the ultimatum had destabilized everyday life. On the other, it had galvanized a new sense of unity. Crowds that once marched in protest against poverty now marched in defense of sovereignty. The message was simple but profound. Better hardship chosen freely than prosperity imposed from abroad. Neighboring states looked on with unease. In Niamey, Bamako, and N'Djamena, governments feared the precedent. If Burkina Faso could defy and survive, might their own populations demand the same? Yet they also saw danger. Instability spreads like wildfire in the Sahel, where borders are porous and economies interlinked. A single disruption in trade flows could cost millions of dollars in lost revenue. Survival in one nation could mean shockwaves in another. Inside Burkina Faso, the sense of siege deepened. Each cyber attack, each rumor of collapse, eroded trust in institutions. Yet at the same time, the very fragility of these systems revealed a deeper truth, that sovereignty in the digital age could not rest on imported software or outsourced networks. It had to be built brick by Africans themselves. This period exposed contradictions within Burkinabe society. Politicians who once relied on foreign backing found themselves marginalized as popular legitimacy shifted toward Traoré. Civil society groups once divided now coalesced around the idea of dignity. Even the youth, long dismissed as apathetic, became central players in defending the nation's narrative. In universities, debates raged about whether sovereignty was simply survival or a new model for the continent's future. Internationally, the ultimatum had become a lightning rod. Western media painted Traoré as reckless, risking his nation's stability. Yet in the streets of Lagos, Johannesburg, and Nairobi, murals of the young leader appeared overnight. To many, he was no longer just the president of a small landlocked country. He was a symbol. The fact that his refusal carried costs made it all the more powerful. But symbols cannot feed families. And so the question deepened. How long could this fragile balance last? Could conviction alone sustain a nation when banks trembled, when lights flickered, when bread grew scarce? Or was the courage of defiance only the first chapter of a longer struggle? As the ultimatum's final hours approached, the world watched not only a president, but an entire people wrestle with the same question. Could dignity itself keep a nation alive? The ultimatum did not remain a private quarrel between Ouagadougou and Tel Aviv. It rippled outward, unsettling capitals across continents. Each actor, whether ally or adversary, read the crisis through its own lens, and each response revealed the fractures of the global order. From Latin America came swift gestures of solidarity. Venezuela offered asylum to Traoré, not only as a political refuge, but as a symbolic rejection of coercion. He crossed the Atlantic. This echoed like a reminder that the South, whether in Africa or the Americas, shared a common story of defiance against larger powers. In Tehran, the response was more tactical. Iran promised cyber defense capabilities, framing the battlefield not in tanks and missiles but in servers and firewalls. It was an admission that 21st century wars could be waged without a single shot. Moscow, true to its recent posture in Africa, signaled willingness to dispatch advisors. Though no specific price tag accompanied the offer, the implication was clear. Russia intended to position itself as a guardian for those willing to resist Western dictates. And then came Beijing's move. Loans and infrastructure pledges worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For a country with a gross domestic product of only 20 billion, such support represented not simply finance, but survival. Yet each alliance was double-edged. To some, these lifelines were proof that Burkina Faso was not isolated. To others, they were new chains disguised as rescue. Was the refusal of one ultimatum leading to the quiet acceptance of another? Meanwhile, the African Union broke precedent with a rare statement condemning foreign attempts at regime change. In Addis Ababa, diplomats debated whether Burkina Faso's ordeal was a singular crisis or the first chapter of a continental struggle. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Chad watched closely, recognizing that what happened in Ouagadougou today could very well be demanded of them tomorrow. Western capitals reacted with unease. In Washington and Brussels, officials initially framed Traoré as reckless. Financial analysts warned investors of instability. Yet behind closed doors, calculations began to shift. The ultimatum, once thought a swift instrument of control, now appeared clumsy. Markets trembled, gold prices spiked, and the risks of confrontation began to outweigh the expected benefits. Even within Israel, dissent emerged. Protests in Tel Aviv criticized the ultimatum as both immoral and strategically foolish, undermining Israel's image abroad. The paradox was becoming clear. Coercion designed to break Burkina Faso had instead elevated it. Internationally, the narrative shifted from one of fragility to one of resilience. The phrase Burkina Faso revolution began to circulate not only in African media, but in editorials across Latin America and Asia, suggesting that a small nation's defiance could inspire far beyond its borders. But as global voices rallied, the question deepened. Was Burkina Faso truly free, or had it merely traded one set of patrons for another, exchanging the ultimatum of Tel Aviv for the embrace of Moscow and Beijing? When the clock struck its final hour and the ultimatum expired without collapse, a new horizon opened for Burkina Faso, but also new uncertainties. Survival itself was a triumph, yet it also posed the pressing question, what comes after defiance? The first answer came in the form of unity. Out of Ouagadougou emerged the Ouagadougou Pact, a treaty signed by 23 African nations. Its promise was simple but profound. No state would face an ultimatum alone again. With a combined gross domestic product of $1.6 trillion, this bloc signaled that Africa was no longer merely a collection of fragile markets, but a coalition with leverage. For the first time in decades, the threat of isolation was met with the shield of solidarity. Economics, too, began to shift. Leaders across the continent accelerated discussions for an African monetary union, aiming to reduce dependence on the dollar and euro in intercontinental trade. Analysts calculated that Africa spends over $5 billion annually in transaction costs simply because trade flows are routed through foreign currencies. Cutting this drain was not only about efficiency, it was about dignity. A shared African currency promised to turn resistance into structural reform. Technology followed closely. Plans for an independent satellite and telecommunications network gathered momentum, with feasibility studies estimating a $12 billion infrastructure program. No longer would Africa rent bandwidth from Europe or Asia. It sought to command its own digital sky. The ultimate lesson of the cyber attacks was clear. Sovereignty in the 21st century required digital autonomy as much as political will. Education, too, became part of the vision. Proposals for an African Leadership Academy spread, designed to train a new generation in geopolitics, economics, and cyber defense. The ultimatum had shown that sovereignty could not be defended by one leader alone. It demanded an entire generation prepared to think beyond borders. Yet shadows lingered. Could unity forged in crisis endure in calmer times? Would African states, long divided by rivalries and external pressures, sustain collective resolve once the immediate storm had passed? Or would the momentum of defiance dissolve into fragmented national interests? For Burkina Faso itself, the path forward remained fragile. The banking sector bore scars of the $50 million lost during the cyber onslaught. Families continued to rebuild from the disruptions in remittances, and foreign investors, while more cautious, still wielded influence through contracts and markets. The victory of resistance had to be translated into tangible policies, schools, hospitals, and opportunities, or else the celebration would fade into memory. The road ahead was neither easy nor certain. The ultimatum had been defeated, but the larger question remained. Could the spirit of those 48 hours be transformed into a permanent architecture of sovereignty? Or would it remain a fleeting spark in Africa's long struggle for dignity? The 48 hours that once began with fear ended as a legend. What was meant to be the countdown to collapse became the clock of defiance, each tick a heartbeat of sovereignty. In those hours, Ibrahim Traoré did more than resist an ultimatum. He carved a message into the very narrative of Africa. The era of submission is not eternal. The lesson was larger than one leader or one nation. It revealed that even the smallest states can withstand the heaviest pressures when conviction outweighs fear. It proved that dignity, though intangible, can outlast dollars and data. And it showed the world that the so-called peripheries of global politics could teach the center its hardest lessons. The phrase Burkina Faso Revolution was no longer confined to headlines. It became shorthand for the possibility of transformation. Yet questions remain. Can this fragile triumph endure against the next storm? Will Africa's new alliances turn into chains or into bridges of opportunity? And most of all, can the fire lit in Ouagadougou spread into a long-term architecture of sovereignty that outlives crises and contracts alike? For Ibrahim Traoré himself, history will forever recall this moment not only as resistance, but as survival. Some already call it the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not a coup imposed upon him, but the coup he delivered against the logic of coercion. In refusing to bow, he staged a coup of dignity. In standing firm, he staged a coup against inevitability itself. The Ibrahim Traoré coup will be remembered not as a fall, but as a refusal to fall. The world must now ask, if a $20 billion economy can withstand threats from trillion-dollar powers, what stops others from reclaiming their voices too? Is this the dawn of a new chapter where Africa dictates terms instead of receiving them? Or is it only a fleeting triumph, soon to be tested again? Do not let the story fade. Share this video, add your voice in the comments, and subscribe to keep this conversation alive. What happened in those 48 hours was not only history, it was a signal to the future.